In Vietnam, two different kinds of war are being fought. Down in the south, there's the guerrilla war, a war of hit-and-run tactics and small operations. But up in the north, two regular armies face each other. America's crack troops, 70,000 Marines, are strung out along the so-called demilitarized zone, facing the North Vietnamese regular army, whose supply lines are short and whose equipment is good. From Tien, John Edwards reports.
Tien is the closest American position to North Vietnam. It's an isolated outpost, surrounded by territory favorable to the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong guerrillas. A small hill, searingly hot, chokingly dusty, which commands the surrounding countryside and overlooks the so-called demilitarized zone, or DMZ, which divides North from South Vietnam. The Americans along the demilitarized zone are dangerously thin on the ground, as I found out when I went out on a marine operation into the DMZ. It was only the second time the Americans had ventured into what was formerly no man's land. I traveled on a supply convoy to one of the marine units operating inside the zone. The North Vietnamese have been using the DMZ to infiltrate troops into the south and also to harass American positions with artillery fire. The aim of the marine operation was, according to one general, to show that the southern half of the DMZ is ours to go in any way we want, at any time. Another officer described the operation as a quiet stroll into the DMZ. They were soon proved wrong. The Marine battalion in the zone was savagely ambushed by the North Vietnamese regulars, and our supply convoy soon became a relief column. Reinforcements were sent to the area to try to relieve the ambushed battalion. The North Vietnamese, who know the area inside out, had let the Marines walk in the zone a whole day without engaging them, and had, as always, picked their own time and place to hit them. Our relief column could hear the battle raging, but couldn't advance, since the North Vietnamese had cut the road. Outmaneuvered on the ground, the Marines had to call for airstrikes to avoid being wiped out. While officials back in Saigon were playing down the battle, a few of the ambushed managed to break out in a column of tanks piled with the pathetic debris of the dead and wounded Marines. Some of the wounded who had got out were evacuated by helicopter in the rear. But some in the ambush couldn't be got out and died from their wounds. This was not the quiet stroll into the DMZ that had been forecast. In case a do-or-die relief effort was necessary, more Marines were brought up as dusk fell. You don't hear these men talk about fighting for freedom in Vietnam. You do hear them, for all their courage, talk about the chances of getting out alive after 13 months of this kind of war. This night, though, they didn't have to tempt fate. After the punishing airstrikes of the day came the artillery barrage of the night. The North Vietnamese, constantly pounded, retreated into the scrub and woods to fight another day, at another time and place of their own choosing. Next morning, the ambushed battalion came out of the demilitarized zone back to South Vietnam. In Saigon, the figures were being arranged in the best light possible. They said enemy dead were 55 confirmed, but they could be higher. The Marines' casualty toll, at least 35 dead, 178 wounded. Their quiet stroll in the DMZ was over.
John Edwards then asked the American commander in Vietnam, General Westmoreland, whether he thought the war had reached a stalemate.
Without question, the war is not stalemated. We're making steady progress week by week, month by month. Needless to say, we've got a long ways to go, but progress is definitely being made.
Do you see Vietnam as a bottomless pit for American troops?
I think additional forces are desired. However, I don't consider it a bottomless pit by any means.
You've been here nearly 4 years now. How have your ideas of the war changed? There have been many optimistic statements, and it looks like a long, hard pull now. How have your ideas of the war changed?
Well, this is a very complex subject to discuss in a few small words. Needless to say, I've learned a great deal in the almost 4 years that I've been here. At least it'll be 4 years in January next. The nature of guerrilla warfare, the tactics and techniques of the communist war of national liberation, all of which has been directed from Hanoi, have taught us many lessons. The situation, I would say, is more complex than I thought was the case 4 years ago. But I must say, during the last 3.5 years that I've been here, we've had some very low points, and I think the lowest point was in the spring of 1965. At which time our president made the very courageous decision to commit American forces. Since that time, things have been looking up, and they're looking up more and more every day.
Do you think the war can be won and not just not lost?
Well, of course, our strategy in the South is a defensive one, because it is our national policy not to enlarge the war. So we are necessarily on the strategic defensive in the South. Now, fortunately, we do have an offensive strategy, and that is an air strategy to the north. Now, the enemy, on the other hand, has an offensive ground strategy. He is moving troops, materiel, ammunition and quantity to the south in order to exercise his control over the people and hopefully dominate the South Vietnamese and subvert the government to the form that is desired by Hanoi. Now, our offensive strategy, however, has forced them to an air defensive in the south. And this has resulted in the necessity by the enemy of diverting large resources and men and materials to provide a defense against our air efforts and to maintain his lines of communication, which are being pounded by our air efforts.
Can you state how long the whole thing's going to be now? Do you think it's going to be very long?
It's
5,
impossible.
10, 20 years?
Completely impossible to predict how long it will last. I feel it will go on perhaps for some time. At least we must be prepared physically and psychologically for such a development.
Do you think that without more troops, the war can be won?
I think there are sufficient men in Vietnam now not to lose the war. But if we could reinforce our present forces, I think we would accelerate our progress.